Hi, everybody. Scott Postma here, and I wanted to take a few minutes and share some best practices for getting a liberal arts education. And in studying Old Western culture or the humanities, we have a certain approach that we believe, is most helpful in being able to learn and grow in our education. And so I wanted to just give this little presentation called How to Participate in the Great Conversation. The Great Conversation's been going on for more than 2,500 years, and it is a discussion between some of the greatest thinkers and writers in the Western tradition. And when we talk about the Great Conversation, we're talking about liberal arts, talking about the humanities, talking about the great books. And when we say the great books, we don't mean necessarily that every great book is necessarily a good book. We just mean that the books have been timeless. They have been, observed, read, over and over and over again. Ideas have been discussed and implemented, sometimes for the good, sometimes for the bad. And so we get an idea of how the Western civilization has been shaped, and really how the thinking of the world has been shaped because of some of these great books. And so this presentation is a brief presentation on how to participate in the Great Conversation. Robert Hutchins made the observation that the object of education is to prepare the young to educate themselves throughout their lives. And most of the classical writers of humane letters all recognized that those who received a classical education would grow to a place where they didn't need a teacher any longer, because they knew how to educate themselves in just about any topic, just about any area. And so this is part of the goal of a classical Christian or a liberal arts, Christian liberal arts education. So I want to offer 4 keys to getting the most out of your education in the Old Western culture courses. And as you know, I teach both the Greeks and the Romans. And so this will apply to any of the Old Western culture courses. And so there's really 4 keys that we're going to focus on in these few moments. We're going to focus on active reading, interpretive questions, artful conversation, and imaginative application. These are the 4 keys for having the best experience as you read through these great books. So C.S. Lewis once said, "I believe that many who find that nothing happens when they sit down or kneel down to a book of devotion would find that the heart sings unbidden while they're working their way through a tough bit of theology with a pipe in their teeth and a pencil in their hand." Now this, as C.S. Lewis says, I think would apply to any of the old books, that the best way for us to approach them is at least with a pencil in our hand. And this is something that we call active reading. And so active reading goes something like this. Whenever you read one of the great books, you're picking up the Aeneid, or you're going to pick up the Iliad or the Odyssey, and you're going to read with a pencil in your hand. And the idea is that you're going to pretend that the author's ghost is present when you read, and you're going to ask him or her questions. And so you're going to pick up and you're reading Homer, and you're coming across ideas, you're coming across thoughts that you're wondering, what does this mean? How does this apply? What is the significance? You're asking questions. And so you're going to, in a sense, have an active conversation, with the author. And so when you think about reading these primary sources, it's not Mr. Callahan, if you're in Old Western culture, or Mr. Postma and the Greeks and Romans, that really is your teacher. It's more like Homer is your teacher, or Plato, or Aristotle, or Cicero, or Virgil. And these writers, these thinkers, become your teacher, and so you're asking them questions. Now, obviously, we're pretending the ghost is there, but we don't mean that in a mysterious, mystical way. We mean that in the sense that you're picking up the book, you're reading it, and you're wanting to engage as if the author was teaching you and speaking to you. And so one of the ways we do that is we mark the text. and we write notes and symbols in the margins or within the text. And so if you've come from a home where, it's forbidden, or in the library it's forbidden to write in books, that's not going to be our approach at all. Now, perhaps that's not going to work, for you to be able to write in a book. You could use sticky notes or other, means to do this. But typically what we like to see people do is to mark the text and make themselves notes as they're working through the book. So as they're going along, they find something that stands out, and they want to be able to quickly reference it in the future. Want to come back to that and maybe revisit it, and maybe an underline in a particular sentence or paragraph would be appropriate. Maybe putting a question mark out next in the margin to a particular thought or idea that you don't know what they mean by that, or you're not sure if you actually agree, or maybe you're wondering why they said that here and something else somewhere else. And it sounds like they're contradicting themselves. So you put a question mark there because this is something that you want to come back and you want to really think about, and you're questioning whether you understand it, or you're questioning whether you agree with what they're saying. Sometimes I'll use an X on an area where I just absolutely disagree with the author. I understand what they're saying, conceptualize it, but I don't think that this is a good idea, and I want to come back and rethink this some more. Maybe I'll see something that I really agree with. I think this is a fantastic idea, and I'll put an exclamation point next to it, or maybe a star, and that tells me I might use that as a quote in a paper that I'm writing or an article or something. Perhaps I'll put brackets around a section or put a check mark by it. And you can come up with your own symbol, system of symbols. But the main key is that you're reading actively. You're talking through what you're reading. You're asking questions. And then I like to underline unfamiliar words. And I'll continue to read the passage and try to understand what the word means in its context, in the context of the sentence or the paragraph. And then after I'm finished with my reading for a sitting, I'll go back and look those words up in a dictionary and see if that meaning makes sense in that particular place. And maybe in a notebook, I'll write down that word and definition so that I'll remember it for the future. And that's a good way to keep a notebook of a building vocabulary. And then lastly, with active reading, we keep a commonplace book. Commonplace book is any kind of a book. You can use a composition book. Here's an example. A composition book is 50 cents or $1 at Walmart or your famous office, your favorite office supply store. I use a leather book that my son-in-law brought me back from Afghanistan, and it's a nice journal, and I keep my commonplaces. And a commonplace is something like a quip or a quote or a maxim that you're going to reflect on, or you're going to want to remember and use as like a little proverb at some point. And so it's a great idea or a meaningful statement that's kind of packed into a few short words and, a simple sentence. And so you want to keep a commonplace book of these kinds of quotes and quips and maxims. The second key, first key there is active reading, but then the second key is to bring interpretive questions to our recitation time. And several people have asked, what is an interpretive question? How is that different than other kinds of questions? And so we'll talk about some of the different kinds of questions, but an interpretive question is one that fuels the great conversation, or as somebody said, it's the fuel that drives the great conversation. And so interpretive questions are those that are going to make the conversation go forward. It's going to keep us discussing and thinking about these ideas in a very meaningful way. So the three kinds of questions that people typically ask of a text. First of all, there's factual questions. It's not that we're not interested in them at all, but for the sake of recitation, we're not really looking to bring factual questions to our recitation. Factual questions are ones that are indisputable or straightforward. Like we might say, what color of hair does the protagonist have? If the text tells us that, that's an indisputable, the answer is indisputable. We're not going to discuss that. That's what the author says the color of the hair is, or what color their eyes, or where were they sitting. So factual questions are indisputable. They're straightforward. There's not a lot of conversation that needs to be had of them. Certainly, it's important to know the facts of the story or of the history or the philosophy, but these are not the kinds of questions we're most interested in. Interpretive questions, these are the ones we're most interested in. And an interpretive question calls for assessment. It forces us as we read to weigh the ideas that are being presented. It causes us to have to make inferences. And so you might think of an interpretive question as one that raises curiosity. It's a question that's discussable. So we're asking, what does the author mean when he says this? What are we supposed to infer from this? What is the implication or significance of the author saying this if he says this other thing somewhere else? How are we supposed to reconcile those? Or a simple, straightforward question that's just, what does he mean? I don't understand what he's saying here. And so that's an interpretive question. A third kind of question is an evaluative or application question. And so evaluative or applicable questions, these are important on a personal level, but they're not important or as important as our interpretive questions. And so an evaluative question makes a judgment after the conversation, and we reserve that for your independent work. So in other words, once we've had all the discussions, once we've fleshed these things out and talked about them, you're going to, on your own, be working through maybe a paper or an assignment, and you're going to come to some conclusions on your own and make assertions. And so you're going to ask questions about that. Given the fact that we think this is what the author means, how would we make application? Or this is what I think the application should be. And so evaluative and applicable questions are important, but they're not interpretive questions. And so we might say it this way, that an interpretive question is a short question that oftentimes it will ask why. It'll ask, how are we to understand the author? Or it'll ask, doesn't this contradict an earlier statement, or something like that. So interpretive questions are things that we're going to discuss, things we want to weigh out and assess and find out exactly what we think the author means and what the implications of that particular interpretation might be. All right. Now, the third key is an artful conversation. And this is the point of recitation. I think you'll hear Wes Callahan say at times that the rabbit trail is the point, right? We want to discuss these ideas and see where it leads us. And so artful conversation is what we would call a work of analysis, right? We are dialoguing. We are trying to decipher. We're trying to break down meanings, take things apart and see what it actually means. A good conversationalist knows how to keep the discussion alive. And so a good conversationalist isn't going to blurt out well, this is what it means and I know it, because that's not a good conversationalist. A good conversationalist wants to keep the conversation alive, wants to find out, can we dig this out any deeper? Is there anything that can we break this down further? Can we think about this in a different way? We want to keep this conversation alive until we've exhausted the idea as much as is possible in the time that we have together. A good conversationalist does not monologue. They're not going to take the time in the class to tell everybody else what they should believe or what they should think about it. Now, you very well may have an opinion, but that's what we save. You save that for the time of writing your paper or filling out an assignment or answering a question that way. But the time of our recitation is a time for conversation and dialogue. A good conversationalist looks for implications. They look for fallacies in a statement. They look for inferences. And so implications are, what would be the result if this is what the author means? If it means this, then what does that imply should be done, or what is the consequence of that idea? A fallacy is an error in reason. How did the author come up with this idea? Because isn't this a tu quoque fallacy, or isn't this a fallacy of distraction, a red herring? Isn't this a false dilemma? We might think about some of the different kinds of fallacies that will come up in a discussion like this. And then the inferences. How does this relate to something else? What other thing should we be knowing, or should we be understanding, or should we be connecting to this? And because of what we've read or what we understand it to mean, if we understand it this way. And so we want to find out all the inferences. A good conversationalist first attempts to strip away ideas that are not the answer. You'll find this in Plato's dialogues where Socrates will, never get us maybe to the exact answer we're hoping that he's going to give us, but he's going to show us over and over and over how there's a lot of false ideas and how all the ideas that we may come up with may break down. And this gets us closer to what the truth is. But again, it still leaves the idea open for us to discuss it a little bit further. And so a good conversationalist first attempts to strip away ideas that are not the answer. We want to try to get to the root of what it is or get closer to it, like peeling off the petals off of a rose, like, well, this isn't it and this isn't it. And so we talk those things through that way. A good conversationalist is not immediately set on a position and is open to other ideas. And so a good conversationalist, again, kind of coming back to the monologue and such, is somebody who's going to consider the other ideas. And they're going to look at the ideas, implications and fallacies and inferences that are presented when somebody says, well, I wonder if the author means this, or, how would this apply if we did it this way? And so we're going to consider all these ideas. And it was Aristotle, I believe, who says that the making of a philosopher is someone who can handle an idea and analyze it in all of its intricacies, even if we totally disagree with it and don't embrace the idea. We can look at things as philosophers that, aren't pleasant to us personally, but we're looking at it objectively as an idea, turning it over and over and over again until we really understand the thing itself for what it is. Not necessarily at this point its moral implications or necessarily, other implications that could follow, but really understanding the thing of itself, of course, with its moral implications down the road, we'll consider all those, but really what is the thing itself? And that's what a good conversationalist is able to do. All right. This brings us to the fourth key, and that is an imaginative application. So once we've gone through the process of asking the right questions and really digging in and trying to wrestle with this and peel off all the layers of that onion, we'll come to a time when we're going to write and we're going to assert an idea or put forth our interpretation or what we believe, based on everything that we do know. And this we'll see in a moment is the process of synthesis. But an imaginative application, I think of Albert Einstein. He says imagination is more important than knowledge. For knowledge is limited to all we know now, or all we now know, and understand, while imagination embraces the entire world and all there ever will be to know and understand. So imagination looks beyond what we already possess, the knowledge we already know. And so we want to have imaginative application. We want to use our imagination, not in a fanciful way, but in a way that sees beyond what we've already embraced or what we've already established to be true. So let me talk a little bit about some of the principles here of an imaginative application. Imaginative application is the work of synthesis, as I mentioned a moment ago. That's forming new ideas out of old ideas. And so analysis is taking things apart. We're breaking it down. Synthesis is putting things back together maybe in a new way, putting it back together in a way that works better or furthers human flourishing. Imagination is the ability to see through the mind's eye what is not yet, but ought to be. And application makes a way for that. And so we're imagining the ordered world as God sees it, but we recognize we don't have this yet, but we can see what it might look like if it were this way. Imaginative application is the ability of the mind to be creative and resourceful in forming new ideas according to the patterns of our divinely ordered world. So we recognize that God has created the cosmos, and as someone who wants to conserve truth but wants to progress along lines that are divinely ordered, we are recognizing and seeing, using our mind's eye to see what it might look like, and using the resources of our mind to do that. And so it's really a creative kind of power. Imaginative application is rooted in what Russell Kirk or Edmund Burke called the moral imagination. And so I want to talk about the moral imagination, which is really the point of us studying the great books, is that we might develop our moral imagination. And maybe the best way for us to imagine what the moral imagination is to hear some of the quotes that some authors who have put forth some ideas, helpful ways of saying it, might give us a framework for thinking about the moral imagination. Ross Betts explains that moral imagination, that should read, is that faculty which informs the habits, practices, affections, and dispositions of a people. And so it's the faculty of the mind. It's that ability to imagine or to think, or to that mind's eye, that envisionment, that it informs how we behave, how we practice our habits, our affections, and dispositions of a population, of any people. And so it's that ability to see what the world should be like. Eva Braun, famous in the world of liberal arts for her longstanding at St. John's College, she explained that the moral imagination is the representation to oneself of concretely visualized human conditions and consequences fed by remembered experience, be it worldly or fictive, and that means, in turn, that it is past nurtured. Now, that's a mouthful, and that's kind of complicated, but really what she's saying is that the moral imagination is our ability to concretely visualize the human condition for what it is, what it should be, because we've read well, because we have paid attention to the experiences in life and human behavior, and because we've gained that through our reading, whether that's fictive or historical or even our own experiences, and we're able to have an imagination nurtured and cultivated by the things that we have experienced, to be able to represent concretely, to really establish this is the way it could look, this is what it should be like, knowing that humans do these certain things and the consequences of them are this. So I may not be doing a very good job of explaining this, but you kind of get the idea of an imagination of what things should be like. And Mark Johnson, he explains it as an ability to imaginatively discern various possibilities for acting in a given situation and to envision the potential help and harm that are likely to result from a given action. So it's our ability to kind of know that ideas have consequences, and how we approach the world that we live in is important. And so we want to develop our moral imagination through these 4 keys. And so just a real quick reminder, the 4 keys to getting the most out of your education in the Old Western Culture courses is to participate in active reading, ask interpretive questions, practice artful conversation, and then make imaginative application. To use that moral imagination to further the ideas that we know are rooted in the good, the true, and the beautiful. Well, I hope these few points are helpful and maybe kind of putting together a framework for thinking about your reading, thinking about the recitations, and the kind of questions that you should be raising to bring to our recitations. So look forward to seeing you in the classroom. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. You have all that in the syllabus, but I wanted to put this out here for you to maybe kind of help answer some of those questions. All right, we'll see you in the classroom.